Dawn broke over a low, flat horizon, and Rotterdam went about its ordinary business, barges easing along the Nieuwe Waterweg, cranes creaking on the quays, clerks and stevedores threading through a web of bridges and streets that had grown up around the river for centuries. In 1940, this was a working city first, an estuary town made powerful by geography. The Maas gave it reach. The dredged channel to the sea gave it speed. Grain, coal and steel moved as if the water itself were a conveyor belt stretching from the North Sea deep into Europe's industrial heartlands. By mid-May, the front had closed in. News of the German advance came faster than the river's current, tightening nerves but not halting work. On the 14th of May, sirens rose and fell across the city. Rotterdammers had heard them before, but the raid that followed was unlike the probes of previous days. The sky filled. The old medieval core, with its tight streets and warehouses, stood exposed beneath it. Fire and shock ran through the centre, and the city's map, carefully drawn over centuries, seemed to tear in an afternoon. The number of dead would be argued over later. In the moment, the scale of loss was measured in smoke and silence. Along the waterfront, the situation was uneven. Some quays burned, sheds and offices along inner basins collapsed or smouldered. Rail spurs buckled where heat took hold. Yet other parts of the harbour, sprawling, compartmentalised, already extending outward from the medieval heart, endured. The river remained what it had always been, a wide, navigable vein. Tugboats nosed through drifting cinders. Men on the piers looked upriver toward the skyline that was no longer there, and then back toward the sea, as if checking that one half of the city could still answer to the other. Military imperatives took over. Occupation made the port's strategic importance plain. A functioning harbour at the mouth of the Rhine-Meuse Scheldt system was no small asset to any army that held it. Docks that could be patched were patched. Berths that could take cargo did so, if only in limited rhythms. But the centre, the literal civic heart, had become a cleared stage. Streets once bounded by gabled houses now opened onto ash and sky. Landmarks that had stitched neighbourhoods together were gone or gutted. The question pressed in on everyone who walked those blocks. What exactly should replace what had been lost? In the days after the smoke lifted, engineers and officials began to sketch answers. Some of those answers were practical to the point of bluntness: clear rubble to make streets passable, shore up damaged quay walls, get the river moving goods again. Others were more ambitious. The cramped, tangled lanes of the old core had long strained against 20th century traffic. Perhaps, the argument went, the catastrophe had made the city's old limitations unacceptable. If Rotterdam was to remain the hinge between ocean and hinterland, it needed space. Boulevards broad enough for trucks, vistas that acknowledged the river as the city's true axis. There were debates even then, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied. Memory argued for restoration, necessity argued for redesign. Which buildings must be saved, and why? Which alignments of streets made sense in a city where ships had grown, cargoes had multiplied, and rail and road competed for the same land? Planners drew lines that not only replaced what had been erased, but also rerouted the very logic of movement through the centre. They wanted a city that faced its river rather than turned its back to the docks, hidden behind warehouses and alleys. Down in the port, the tempo of work was a barometer of possibility. When a berth reopened, it suggested that cargoes could return. When a crane swung again, it suggested that men could be hired back. The harbour had always lived by cycles of boom and lull, but now each sign of recovery carried moral weight. To keep ships calling was to keep Rotterdam connected, to keep the country supplied, to keep bread on tables, to keep the city from becoming an empty scar on a map. Even under occupation, the port's calculus was both local and continental. Families displaced from the centre found temporary places at the fringes or with relatives in districts the fire had spared. They commuted past blocks where nothing remained but charred foundations and short stretches of wall. Children learned new routes to school. Workers heading to the docks noticed that the rhythm of the city had changed. Fewer whistles, more distant rumble, fewer shop fronts, more fences and piles of brick. Yet the river kept its own time. Barges still nosed into the basins at slack tide. Tug captains still watched the wind. The port's continuity, partial though it was, offered a thread to hold on to. In council rooms and engineers' offices, a principle began to crystallize. If Rotterdam were to be remade, the port would not be an afterthought. The economy that tied the Netherlands to the rest of Europe hinged on what the river could deliver and what the quays could turn around. A city plan that privileged vistas without throughput would fail its own people, and a harbour rebuilt without thought for the city's new form would choke on its success. The answer lay in sequence and scale: stabilise the harbour, draw a centre that could carry modern traffic, align both with the waterway that made them possible. As summer edged on, detailed surveys of damage gave way to choices that could not be deferred. Which basins merited immediate investment? Where should rail sidings be relaid? And which inner-city spurs should be abandoned to make way for broader streets? If the old market lanes were too narrow for lorries, where should new arteries cut? And how should they meet the bridges that spanned the Maas? For every decision about a quay wall or warehouse, there was an echo in stone and asphalt a kilometre inland. The first small victories were easily overlooked: a repaired lock gate here, a reopened shed there. But they signalled direction. Some captains who had considered diverting now wrote Rotterdam back into their schedules. Forwarders recalculated transit times and discovered that, even crippled, the port's geography still offered economies no inland route could match. Rumours spread that the centre would not be rebuilt as it had been, and some bristled at the thought. Others, looking at the void, thought modern lines might better fit a modern city. By year's end, the emotional fog had begun to thin into a hard, practical resolve. People who had lost homes wanted a way back to ordinary life. Men and women who had lost streets wanted a city that made sense of the river that defined it. Authorities, local and national, saw the same map and understood that the port was not simply an employer, it was the hinge on which recovery might swing. Out on the water, the tide kept turning at its appointed hours, indifferent and dependable. The centre lay open, a canvas no one had asked for. The harbour, though shaken, still reached toward the sea. Between them stretched a narrow window for decisions that would set Rotterdam's course for a generation. Plans were being drawn, meetings set, priorities hammered into lists. The idea was simple to state and difficult to execute. Rebuild a city by first securing the engine that sustained it. The drawings on those tables hinted at straighter streets, wider quays, and an urban heart turned toward the river, and left a single, pressing question hanging over the smoke-cleared skyline. Could Rotterdam move quickly enough to turn disaster into design before the current pulled opportunity passed? The summer of 1945 settled over a city still marked by its scars. Where old stone had been pulverized, piles of brick waited for carts. Where canals once caught reflections of narrow houses, sunlight now struck open ground. Yet the silence that followed surrender was not stillness. It was preparation. Rotterdam's heart had been emptied, but its harbour kept breathing. Barges from inland continued to nose into the lower basins, bringing coal, cement and timber. The port had to function, even when the city around it barely existed. The first task was brutally simple: clear the wreckage. Crews worked street by street, hauling rubble to makeshift dumps along the Maas. Old foundations were prized up so new roads could run straight. It was slow, physical work, done with barrows, horses and cranes salvaged from the docks. By late 1940, sketches of a possible new city had already appeared, the work of engineer Willem Gerrit Witteveen. His draft tried to balance memory with modernity, keeping familiar alignments while opening new corridors to the river. But wartime occupation meant few plans could be realized. The drawings stayed in drawers. The idea, though, took root. When the war ended, that seed was ready to grow. The occupation left not just ruin, but a question. Should Rotterdam be rebuilt as it was, or reimagined for a different century? Many who remembered the cramped alleys of the medieval core favoured renewal over restoration. They spoke of air, light, and order. In 1946, Cornelis van Traar put forward the Basisplan, a reconstruction blueprint that would shape everything to come. Its principle was direct: build for movement, connect the city and port, and turn Rotterdam's face toward the river instead of away from it. The new layout replaced winding lanes with broad boulevards radiating from the quays. It introduced the window to the river, an open vista from the civic heart to the Maas, symbolizing transparency and trade. Factories and warehouses would concentrate where heavy industry belonged, near the water. Housing would move outward into modern districts of light and space. The inner city would serve commerce and governance, not congestion. It was a map drawn with rulers instead of memories. For those who had lived through the bombing, the plan was both thrilling and alien. The familiar labyrinth would never return. Streets known by generations would vanish beneath grids of new asphalt. But optimism was scarce currency in the Netherlands of 1946, and the vision offered a way forward. Parliament and the City Council approved funding. Engineers began measuring quays, calculating load capacities, and designing bridges that could lift high enough for ocean-going barges. The phrase that passed between planners was simple enough to fit on a wall chart: Eerst de haven, dan de stad, first the port, then the city. That priority reflected more than civic pride. The Netherlands' recovery depended on trade, and trade depended on Rotterdam's reach into Europe's interior. Every ton of material unloaded here rippled outward to factories in the Ruhr, workshops in Belgium, and farms across the lowlands. To restart that circulation was to restart life. The decision was pragmatic: restore throughput, then build houses for the workers who made it possible. The Port Authority moved quickly. Teams surveyed the riverbanks, marking where quay walls could be repaired and where deeper basins might be dredged. The newer WWII, the main artery to the sea, was cleared of wreckage and recharted. British and American engineers advised on modern cranes and cargo sheds. A few of the oldest basins were deemed obsolete and filled in, trading nostalgia for efficiency. Every metre of recovered dock translates into thousands of tons of goods a month. Meanwhile, the city's civilian administration focused on the ground people walked on. Debris clearance crews reclaimed roughly 10 million cubic metres of rubble, some of which was reused as fill for new industrial zones south of the river. Entire blocks were levelled not to erase history, but to provide stable foundations for modern construction. Electricity networks, gas mains, and tram lines were redesigned to suit a more spacious street plan. Nothing about the rebuild was accidental. Even the angles of intersections reflected the needs of lorries that would carry port cargoes inland. Life amid reconstruction demanded compromise. Housing shortages forced thousands into temporary barracks and prefabricated wooden homes. Food was rationed, coal scarce, but the port's slow heartbeat gave rhythm to the days. Ships arrived from Britain and Scandinavia with materials for rebuilding. Barges left loaded with timber, fertilizer, and machine parts. Each exchange made the city less dependent on hope and more on momentum. By 1948, early reports from harbour officials claimed cargo volumes approaching pre-war levels, a sign that Rotterdam was re-establishing its role as Europe's hinge. The transformation carried social consequences. Labour demand soared. Men who had fought or fled returned to find steady work on the docks. New apprenticeships sprang up for crane operators, metal workers, and surveyors. The idea that a port could pull an entire city back to life was no longer theoretical. It was visible in payslips and timetables. Yet tension persisted between speed and identity. Some residents questioned whether the rush for efficiency risked erasing what made the city human. Van Traar's defenders argued that progress itself was a kind of memorial, a proof that destruction had not triumphed. By the early 1950s, the outlines of the new Rotterdam were unmistakable. Wide avenues traced where narrow canals had once run. Modern office blocks began to rise, clad in brick and concrete rather than ornate stone. The skyline no longer resembled the old merchant city, but it faced the same direction, to the water. The Maas was once again lined with cranes, the air filled with the mixed sounds of rebuilding and trade. Photographs from the time show cargo ships moored against rebuilt quays, with skeletal construction frames rising behind them, a city and a harbour rebuilding in tandem. For the first time since the war, hope began to sound practical. The logic that had guided those first sketches, restore the port, then rebuild the city around it, was working. Yet the question lingered beneath every success. Could Rotterdam's rebirth keep pace with the world it aimed to serve? The harbour was growing busier by the month. Europe's economies were quickening, and new ships were already larger than the docks built for them. The plans on the drafting tables would have to stretch farther still, out toward the open sea, if the port was to remain the engine of a continent's recovery. By the spring of 1946, the drawn lines of Van Tra's Basisplan were hardening into stone and steel. Surveyors marked foundations where entire districts had once stood. Engineers traced new arteries through what had been rubble heaps. Rotterdam was no longer a city in ruins. It was a workshop for its own future. The planners' guiding conviction, first the port, then the city, had moved from slogan to operating rule. Every crane, every barge, every metre of rebuilt quay mattered more than any ceremonial street reopening. The harbour would determine whether the Netherlands could recover at all. Europe, too, was shifting from wartime survival to reconstruction. The Rhine basin, though scarred, remained the continent's industrial lung. Coal from Germany, steel from the Ruhr, machinery from Britain, all of it converged somewhere along the North Sea coast. Rotterdam's location made it indispensable. The challenge was not to prove its worth, but to scale its capacity fast enough to serve nations starved of materials. Between 1946 and 1950, the port's revival became both a national project and a continental necessity. Work began with the docks closest to the city. The Lekhaven, Walhaven and Merwehaven basins were dredged, their walls re-poured in reinforced concrete. Thousands of piles, timber, then steel, were driven into the soft delta soil to stabilize the waterfront. Shipyard workers, many of whom had returned from forced labor, found employment repairing tugs and barges that had survived the war. New cranes arrived from Britain, some still marked with military stencils. The rhythm of hammering, welding and whistle calls returned to the river like an echo of the city's pre-war pulse. The figures tell the scale of the effort. In 1947, Rotterdam handled roughly 22 million tons of cargo. By 1950, that number had doubled. Coal and ore moved east toward Germany, grain and timber moved inland, and petroleum products flowed westward to refineries and tankers. The harbour's web of railway links, many still twisted or mined in 1945, was restored under the Ministry of Transport's Spoorwegestel programme. Freight trains once again rolled over the Maas bridges, connecting the docks with the Ruhr's factories, only a day's journey away. Each successful convoy proved that the city's gamble on logistics was paying off. The rebirth carried a social cost that would mark a generation. Housing for dock workers lagged far behind demand. The fires of 1940 had erased entire neighbourhoods, and the new urban plan reserved much of the central land for commerce rather than residences. Thousands of families relocated south of the Maas, in hastily built districts like Charleroi and Feyenoord. Prefabricated houses rose in neat rows, serviced by trams that rattled over temporary bridges. The government's promise of a home for every worker turned into one of the city's hardest logistical puzzles. Even as construction cranes crowded the skyline, city planners faced their first major constraint: water depth. Ships were growing, and the pre-war harbour basins, designed for vessels of 20,000 tons, could not accommodate the new tankers appearing from Britain and the United States. The solution was expansion, not merely repair. Engineers surveyed farther west along the newer waterweg, identifying stretches of reclaimed land where deep-water berths could be cut. Plans for Europort, the Euro Gateway, began as lines on a map in the late 1940s, long before concrete would be poured. The logic was the same that had guided Van Tra's street grid: make space for scale. Technology, too, was evolving. Electric cranes replaced steam. Conveyor belts began to automate coal handling. The first experiments with mechanized bulk loading reduced turnaround times from days to hours. Harbour engineers boasted that ships which once lingered for a week could now be turned in 2 days. Each improvement rippled through the economy. Shorter stays meant lower costs meant more trade, and more trade meant more jobs. Rotterdam's cranes became symbols of movement itself. The human side of that progress remained visible in small, stubborn ways. Men cycled to shifts through streets still lined with half-repaired facades. Women queued at food depots that operated beside shiny new warehouses. On Sundays, families walked to the edge of cleared zones to stare at the skeletons of new bridges rising over the river, proud and uneasy in equal measure. The old city was gone beyond recall, yet in its place stood something coherent, a plan that worked. By the early 1950s, reports from the Port Authority read like dispatches from a front won through logistics rather than arms. Rotterdam had regained its reputation as Europe's fastest harbour. Journalists visiting from abroad marvelled that a city flattened in a single afternoon could become, within a decade, a model of modern efficiency. The American press, flush with Marshall Plan optimism, called it the workshop of Western Europe. Behind the praise lay unromantic realities: budgets stretched thin, imported steel rationed, and workers labouring 6-day weeks under cranes that never slept. Still, the statistics were undeniable. In 1952, the port's throughput reached new records. By 1955, it rivaled Hamburg and Antwerp combined. The Netherlands had staked its recovery on maritime trade, and the gamble was paying off. Each ship that cleared Rotterdam's piers carried more than cargo. It carried proof that deliberate reconstruction could reverse catastrophe. The city's leadership began to speak less about rebuilding and more about outpacing, and yet, as successes accumulated, new ambitions appeared on the horizon. If the restored basins were already straining to hold the traffic of the 1950s, what of the decades ahead? Engineers warned that without an outlet directly to the sea, Rotterdam would choke on its own prosperity. The sketches of a new port district, one extending past the city's traditional limits, started to circulate in official meetings. The idea of a gateway to Europe was shifting from metaphor to blueprint. By the mid-1950s, Rotterdam stood at another threshold, no longer struggling for survival, but preparing for dominance. The cranes and ships had returned, but so had questions of scale, land, and identity. Could the same principles that rebuilt the city now propel it beyond its own riverbanks? The answer lay westward, toward the open waters of the North Sea, where the next chapter of the port's story was about to begin. By 1955, Rotterdam's skyline was no longer one of ruins, but of cranes. The port's steady hum had become the city's heartbeat again, faster, louder, more relentless than before. Yet the success that had saved Rotterdam now demanded a new kind of risk. Ships were growing larger, trade was accelerating, and the city's geography was beginning to feel small. The Maas could only take so much steel and tonnage before its banks pressed back. To stay Europe's primary outlet to the world, Rotterdam would have to expand, outward, into land that did not yet exist. The idea was radical, but in the Netherlands, land had always been negotiable. Engineers proposed carving a new port complex west of the city, closer to the sea. This would mean dredging channels, reclaiming polders, and building entire industrial zones from nothing, It was not repair, but reinvention, a leap beyond the visible horizon. The plan took shape under the name Europort, the European Gateway. Its goal was simple in words, immense in execution: create a port deep and wide enough to serve the next generation of global shipping, while anchoring Western Europe's post-war economy in Dutch soil. Work began quietly, with surveyors driving stakes into the muddy banks along the Nieuwe Waterweg. What they mapped was vast: 20 kilometres of future quays, refineries, and docks stretching toward the Hook of Holland. The design would connect directly to inland waterways and rail lines, giving Rotterdam access to the Ruhr and Rhine without congestion in the old harbour. It was, in essence, the physical embodiment of the city's motto: first the port, then the city. The Reconstruction was becoming an expansion. The 1950s were a time of unshakable faith in progress, and Rotterdam embodied that optimism. Newspapers spoke of a new age of steel and oil. Refineries were planned along the riverbanks, drawing crude shipped from the Middle East and Venezuela. The port would no longer be just a point of transfer. It would be an industrial organism, refining, blending, and exporting at unprecedented scale. The Dutch government, keen to anchor national recovery in international trade, poured resources into the project. Foreign investors followed, seeing Rotterdam as Europe's safest gateway to the Atlantic. The engineering was colossal. To deepen the waterways, dredgers worked day and night, scooping thousands of tons of silt from the channel floor. New sea locks rose from the delta, built to withstand tides and storms. Concrete piers, some stretching hundreds of meters, were designed to berth tankers that dwarfed pre-war freighters. Each section of Europort was named for the function it served: Eemhaven for general cargo, Botlek for chemicals, Vondelingenplaat for oil. Where cows once grazed behind dikes, now pipelines and cranes formed the horizon. The pace of construction transformed daily life. Migrant workers arrived from across the Netherlands and southern Europe, filling temporary hostels near the work sites. Barges loaded with steel pilings moved alongside ships carrying timber, asphalt, and cement. Even the air smelled of change: diesel, salt, and the sharp tang of new concrete. Photographs from the period show men in flat caps and overalls standing beside massive foundations, dwarfed by machinery, but proud of their work. To many, this was not merely rebuilding a city, it was building the future of Europe. By 1960, the first tankers nosed into the new docks. The Sluiskil, a vast lock complex near the river mouth, opened that same year, allowing vessels of record tonnage to dock without waiting for the tide. The success was immediate. Rotterdam's throughput climbed above 100 million tons a year, surpassing Antwerp, Hamburg, and London. 2 years later, the city was declared the world's largest port by cargo volume, a title it would hold for more than 4 decades. The phrase "Gateway to Europe" stopped being a slogan and became a statement of fact. But with expansion came separation. The new industrial zones lie far from the old city centre, physically and symbolically divided by the river. Smoke from refineries drifted toward the skyline, while the people who worked there commuted from new housing estates built hastily on reclaimed ground. The once intimate link between the harbour and the streets of Rotterdam was stretching thin. Children growing up in the 1960s knew the port as a distant silhouette of cranes, not a neighbour. What had once been a city built around a harbour was becoming a harbour with a city attached. Urban planners noted the paradox with concern. The functional separation that kept heavy industry away from residential districts also kept prosperity at a remove. The economic pulse of Rotterdam was stronger than ever, but its benefits often bypassed the people who still remembered the ruins of 1940. Housing remained scarce, and rents crept upward as new workers flooded in. The shining efficiency of the docks contrasted with the grey austerity of daily life inland. Progress had its shadows, yet optimism remained the dominant note. Each new pier, each completed refinery was seen as vindication of the choices made in those desperate post-war years. Van Tra's insistence on prioritizing infrastructure had given Rotterdam a foundation wide enough to carry the ambitions of a continent. From the deck of a departing ship, the skyline seemed to tell the story in a single glance. From medieval church spire to modern office block to the endless forest of cranes beyond, every line pointed seaward. By the early 1960s, planners already spoke of pushing farther still, of reclaiming a new tract of land beyond Europort, to be called Maasvlakte, where the river would meet the North Sea directly. It was an audacious thought, a port without limits, built entirely on human determination. For Rotterdam, the question was no longer whether it could survive, but how far it dared to grow. The city had risen from ashes to authority in less than 2 decades. But as its ships grew larger and its shoreline longer, another question lingered behind the triumphs. Could the people who had rebuilt the port still recognize the city it had created? By 1962, the numbers spoke louder than any speech could. Rotterdam had become the busiest port on earth. Each tide carried proof of it. Freighters from New York and tankers from the Persian Gulf, grain ships from Canada, and barges from the Ruhr. Cranes moved without pause, lifting, swinging, and stacking, an industrial ballet that defined a nation's recovery. To the rest of Europe, this was the port that fed factories, lit homes, and rebuilt economies. To Rotterdam itself, it was the heartbeat that had never stopped. In the city's offices, officials marked the milestone with quiet pride. 2 decades earlier, they had stood amid rubble. Now their maps were crowded with new basins, rail yards, and refineries. Europort's opening had pushed Rotterdam's reach far beyond its own horizon. Oil from distant seas was refined on its reclaimed land and sent up the Rhine to fuel West Germany's industries. Grain unloaded from American freighters filled barges bound for inland mills. Steel, coal, and chemicals flowed through Rotterdam as if the river itself had become a moving assembly line. The Marshall Plan had ended, but its legacy, Europe's economic acceleration, was visible everywhere in the harbour. By the mid-1960s, Western Europe was producing and consuming at record levels. Rotterdam stood at the centre of that expansion, serving as the funnel through which goods moved in and prosperity moved out. The port's geography gave it an advantage, but its success came from something deeper, a relentless focus on efficiency. Every system, dockside cranes, customs clearances, rail connections, was designed to turn time into throughput. The port's inland links made that possible. Freight trains rolled eastward along the Nieuwe Maas bridges into the heart of Germany's Ruhrgebiet, a region whose own factories depended on Rotterdam's speed. Barges carrying coal and ore navigated canals that reached as far as Switzerland. Few ports could match such reach. Antwerp, Hamburg, and Le Havre all competed for traffic, but none could equal Rotterdam's combination of depth, access, and capacity. The phrase "gateway to Europe" was now shorthand in shipping circles for a network that bound together the continent's economy. But the port's rise reshaped the city in ways less visible to outsiders. The population surged as thousands arrived seeking work in refineries, construction, and shipping. Between 1950 and 1965, Rotterdam's workforce more than doubled, drawing labour from southern Europe, North Africa, and the rural Netherlands. Whole new neighbourhoods, Pendrecht, Hoogvliet, Ommoord, appeared on the map, built with the same pragmatic geometry as Van Tra's downtown grid. Rows of concrete apartment blocks rose on reclaimed soil, designed for speed and numbers rather than comfort. They housed the hands that kept the cranes moving. The economic rhythm was intoxicating but uneven. Dock workers laboured under constant pressure. Strikes in the late 1950s over wages and hours signalled that not all benefited equally from the city's resurgence. Inland, shopkeepers complained of rising rents, while planners worried about congestion as lorries clogged the new boulevards. Prosperity had returned, but it was built on ceaseless motion. Ships, trucks, trains, all converging and departing without rest. The port's efficiency was the city's pride and its burden. Still, there was wonder in what had been achieved. Visitors arriving by train saw a skyline transformed. The Lorenskirk, once a lonely survivor amid ruins, now surrounded by mid-century towers of glass and concrete. The Cool Single, widened into a grand avenue, led directly toward the Maas, fulfilling the dream of a city that faced its river. In the evenings, the waterfront shimmered with reflected light from the cranes. Locals joked that you could navigate home by the glow of the refineries. Across the Maas, the industrial panorama seemed endless. Vast oil terminals at Botlek and Pernis stretched toward the sea, connected by a forest of pipelines. The scent of petroleum hung in the air, a constant reminder of the new economy. Rotterdam had become Europe's refinery as much as its port. Tankers arriving from the Gulf were emptied, their crude transformed into fuel that powered cars, aircraft, and industry across the continent. Economists described it as the energy corridor of Western Europe. Human geography changed along with the industry. Old waterfront districts like Katendrecht and Delfshaven lost their docks to larger facilities downstream, and their communities were displaced to the city's fringes. What had once been tight-knit quarters of sailors and shipwrights became quiet backwaters, shadows of a working-class life being replaced by mechanization. Yet few protested loudly. Prosperity dulled nostalgia. Most believed, as city leaders repeated, that progress required sacrifice, and that Rotterdam's destiny was to serve the world. By 1965, the port's throughput had doubled again, surpassing 150 million tons. The city's newspapers called it Europe's artery. On the river, traffic lights were installed for ships, so dense was the movement. The skyline bristled with masts, cranes, and refinery chimneys, a man-made forest against the low Dutch sky. Each arrival and departure measured how far the city had come since 1940. The harbour that had once been half-burned and silted was now a machine of staggering precision. Still, planners sensed the limits approaching. Even Europort, that vast stretch of reclaimed ground, was nearing capacity. To remain ahead, Rotterdam would have to extend itself once more, beyond the polders, into the sea itself. The term Maasvlakte began appearing in official papers, a vision of an artificial promontory carved out of the North Sea, where the next era of shipping would anchor. The idea sounded impossible, but so had rebuilding a city from ashes. Rotterdam had not merely recovered, it had reinvented itself. Yet behind the statistics and milestones lay a quiet truth. The war's destruction had given the city both its burden and its freedom. Freed from its medieval past, Rotterdam had built a modern identity from water, steel, and motion. As the decade turned, the challenge was no longer to rise from ruin, but to understand what it meant to live in a city built entirely on the promise of progress. And somewhere beyond the breakwaters, dredgers were already beginning to test the seabed, preparing for the next leap forward into land that did not yet exist, and a future that would test how far even Rotterdam could go. By the mid-1960s, Rotterdam had achieved what once seemed impossible. It had transformed from a city of ash into the industrial heart of Western Europe. Yet success carried its own weight. The cranes that had symbolized rebirth now swung over a city straining to keep pace with its own expansion. The port's growth was unstoppable, but the city behind it, its streets, its people, its planners, was beginning to feel the limits of a reconstruction conceived in another age. Cornelis van Tra's Basisplan, drafted in the Optimism of 1946, had served its purpose. It had rebuilt the centre, restored function, and tied the city once more to the river. But the plan had been made for a port city of 500,000 souls. Now, 1 million people moved within its orbit, and the scale of industry had dwarfed the very idea of an urban core. Office towers lined Cool Single. New residential estates stretched toward the horizon. The once revolutionary grid of streets now struggled under endless traffic. What had been a symbol of modern order began to feel rigid. unable to absorb the vitality it had unleashed. By 1966, engineers and sociologists were speaking of a city-port divide. Rotterdam's port area extended more than 40 kilometres toward the sea, its workforce scattered across industrial zones unreachable by tram or bicycle. The harbour had become a landscape of oil tanks, rail sidings and pipelines, a place of work but not of habitation. To reach it meant hours on crowded buses or company ferries. The labour that had rebuilt Rotterdam was now separated from the city it had created. The consequences were both physical and human. In the older quarters near the river, businesses that once served dock workers began to vanish. Cafes closed, boarding houses emptied. The rhythmic whistle of shift changes no longer echoed across the rooftops. Children who had grown up watching ships from their windows now looked out on ring roads and car parks. The city's relationship with the water, the intimacy that had defined its history, was fading into abstraction, yet even as that bond loosened, the scale of the harbour kept expanding. The Europort project continued westward, and talk of Maasvlakte grew more insistent. In the offices of the Port Authority, engineers sketched outlines for an entirely new polder in the North Sea, land to be reclaimed from waves and wind, a harbour built where none had existed. The argument was mathematical. Without deeper berths and wider basins, Rotterdam would lose the next generation of ships to rivals abroad. But beneath the calculations lay something more, a determination to prove that reconstruction had not been a single moment in time, but a way of thinking that could stretch into the future. For ordinary Rotterdammers, life in the 1960s was a balance between pride and fatigue. Jobs were plentiful, wages rising, and the city's name had become shorthand for progress. Yet housing shortages persisted. Whole families lived in flats built at record speed from concrete panels, efficient but austere. Air pollution from refineries darkened the skyline, and complaints about the smell of oil became part of the city's vernacular. The cost of being Europe's engine was becoming visible in its lungs. In planning circles, a new generation began to question the ethos of the Reconstruction city. Younger architects argued that the post-war modernism, so decisive in 1946, had grown impersonal. They called for green spaces, cultural districts and housing closer to the riverbanks again. Their sketches imagined reconnecting the citizen to the port, not just as labour, but as identity. The debate was less about cranes and tonnage than about memory. Could a city that had rebuilt itself from nothing afford to remember what it once was? Symbols of reflection appeared amid the concrete. In 1953, a bronze figure by sculptor Osip Zadkin was unveiled in the city centre. The destroyed city. Arms raised to the sky, a hollow in its chest where a heart should be, it became Rotterdam's silent conscience. Visitors paused before it, hearing in its stillness the echo of that single afternoon in 1940 when the old city vanished. To some, it marked grief. To others, defiance. Either way, it reminded passers-by that the new Rotterdam stood on the absence of the old. By the late 1960s, the cracks in Van Tra's plan had turned into opportunities. Waterfronts no longer suited for heavy cargo began to attract artists and small workshops. Abandoned warehouses were converted into studios. The same open space that had once symbolized destruction now offered room for reinvention. The city's identity began to tilt again, from an engine of survival to a laboratory of design and culture. Reconstruction, it seemed, had no clear endpoint. Still, the port's rhythm remained dominant. From the bridges, one could watch the endless procession of vessels, tankers, freighters, barges, all bound inward or outward, all feeding the intricate economy that linked Rotterdam to the world. Each siren at the harbour mouth marked another transaction between past and future. The city that had once been flattened was now so vast that it seemed to stretch beyond geography itself, a continuous landscape of motion. As the 1970s approached, Rotterdam faced a quieter but deeper question. The war had forced it to start again. Prosperity had made it powerful. But could power and memory coexist? Could a city built on water remember its reflection? Standing on the Erasmus Bridge at dusk, the skyline glowed with sodium light. The cathedral, the office towers, the refineries, and far beyond them, the cranes of Europort reaching into the dark. The distance between them measured not failure, but transformation, the evolution from a port city into a city of ports. The harbour had saved Rotterdam. Now it would test how the city might save its soul. By the early 1970s, Rotterdam had become both a success and a question mark. The war's ruin had been replaced by the world's most efficient harbour. Yet the human city, the one that had once pulsed around the docks, seemed increasingly distant from the vast machine it had built. From the air, the city looked like an arrow stretching to the sea, an unbroken corridor of refineries, cranes, and warehouses reaching into the North Sea. On paper, it was the pride of Western Europe. On the ground, it was still searching for itself. The expansion westward had continued without pause. The Maasvlakte, the Basisplan, was no longer just a plan. Dredgers had made it real. In a feat of engineering that recalled the country's centuries-long battle against the sea, the Netherlands reclaimed thousands of hectares of seabed, enclosing them behind new dikes and filling them with sand pumped from the ocean floor. Here, the next generation of ports took shape, basins deep enough for the supertankers and bulk carriers of a new global age. Where the war had once erased a city, human will now erase the sea itself. The logic was irresistible. The port must always move outward. The Europort complex, once a marvel, was already nearing capacity. Oil companies, Shell, Esso, BP, demanded deeper berths and broader plots for refineries and petrochemical plants. The container revolution was beginning, and Rotterdam meant to lead it. In 1966, the first container cranes arrived at Eemhaven, steel giants capable of lifting cargo measured not in sacks or barrels, but in standardized boxes. It was a small innovation that would rewrite global trade. The docks of the future would no longer rely on the strength of men, but on the choreography of machines. For Rotterdam's workforce, that change was double-edged. Automation promised speed and safety, but it also reduced the need for labour. The children of dock workers found themselves trained for new skills: mechanics, technicians, administrators. The physicality that had defined port life gave way to supervision and control rooms. For the first time in living memory, some cranes moved without a hand on their levers. Progress was steady, unstoppable, and strangely impersonal. At the same time, the city behind the harbour began to reinvent its relationship with the water. Urban planners, recognizing the emotional distance that industrial growth had created, looked for ways to bring the river back into civic life. The North Bank, long walled off by warehouses, saw the beginnings of cultural redevelopment. Old quays near the centre, once choked with freight, were cleared for pedestrian promenades and cafes. The city that had been rebuilt to serve the port now began to reclaim its river as a place to live. There was symbolism in every brick. The Lorenskerk, once blackened and half-ruined, had been painstakingly restored stone by stone, a gesture that seemed to reconcile the old Rotterdam with the new. Nearby, Zadkind's sculpture. The destroyed city stood as witness, its hollow torso framed against a skyline that no longer remembered silence. Visitors photographed it with cranes rising behind, as if the two belonged to the same sentence: loss, then labour. By the mid-1970s, a new tone entered the city's story, one of reflection rather than momentum. The Dutch called it Wederopbouw's einde, the end of Reconstruction. For 30 years, rebuilding had been both a necessity and an identity. Now, with the port unmatched and the city stable, the question shifted from how to why. What kind of city had Rotterdam become? Was it still a community or an infrastructure? Economists praised its output: 200 million tons of cargo in a year, refineries that fed half of Europe's cars, a logistics chain reaching from the Atlantic to the Alps. Yet sociologists wrote of alienation, of citizens who lived beside the greatest harbour on earth but felt no part of it. Pollution thickened over the estuary, oil slicks drifted along the quays. The same water that had once symbolised rebirth now mirrored the costs of success. Still, amid steel and smoke, signs of renewal appeared. Students from Delft and Erasmus universities began experimenting with architecture that softened the city's harsh geometry: tilted cube houses, pedestrian bridges, and cultural halls. Their designs acknowledged the irony at the heart of Rotterdam's story, that in losing its past, the city had gained the freedom to invent endlessly. By 1975, the harbour lights stretched 50 kilometres to the sea, visible from aircraft descending toward Amsterdam. Each one marked a ship, a crane, or a refinery tower, a constellation built by human hands. Rotterdam had become a symbol of recovery so complete it seemed almost mythic, a city annihilated and reborn not once, but continually, through work. The historians who began to write about it chose their words carefully. They called Rotterdam the phoenix of the Low Countries, a place where destruction had not merely been overcome, but transformed into a design principle. To rebuild was no longer an act of survival, it was the city's nature. And yet, standing on the quay at night, watching the ships drift silently toward the North Sea, one could still trace the faint outline of the old harbour in the dark water, a memory beneath the lights. The cranes turned, the river moved, and beyond the breakwaters lay the vast, patient sea, waiting for whatever the next generation would dare to build. Rotterdam had fed Europe, powered its engines, and proved what resolve could accomplish. Now, in the calm after 3 decades of creation, it faced a different challenge: to remember that a city's heart, once lost, could never be entirely rebuilt in steel. The tide rose against the pylons, whispering the same lesson it had taught since 1940, that every beginning here is born from the work of starting again.